Good morning, everyone. We will start in 2 minutes. Magandang umaga po sa lahat. Good morning, everyone. I am Jelly Galang, a member of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, or PACS, and I will be the moderator in today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on the PACS Facebook page. Before we proceed, let me remind our Zoom participants to please observe proper online decorum. Kindly ensure that you are on mute, especially during the webinar when the speaker is doing his presentation. We will have an open forum after the speaker has presented. So if you have any questions or comments, you may ask him directly. You may ask them directly to the speaker. Just raise your hand. There's a button on your Zoom screen. Just press it so I can acknowledge you. Or you may post your question on the Zoom chat box. Okay. So without further ado, let me introduce our distinguished speaker this morning. Our speaker is a veteran China watcher and former foreign Beijing bureau chief for CNN between 2001 and 2014, and Time Magazine between 1982 and 2000. He is fluent in Filipino, English, and Mandarin Chinese. He is currently an adjunct professor at Peking University and teaches courses on China and the media. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker this morning, Mr. Jaime Florcruz. Sir Jimmy.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to join you, and thank you for spending your morning with me. I guess most of us are in a state of lockdown, or at least dealing with the pandemic. I hope you are all staying well. And I wish to thank PACS, Philippine Association for China Studies, for this opportunity to share with you my experience and my thoughts about one thing that we all share interest in, which is China. I have prepared a PowerPoint so that it will help me go with the flow. Let me share my screen. Hold on. Okay. So as a history student, I wish to take you today on a virtual look back at China's contemporary history. I wish to take you through China's pivotal 5 decades using 30 objects as markers of what I've done and seen and experienced. So imagine this as a short show and tell on contemporary Chinese history. It's like Chinese History 101. I've arranged them chronologically, curated in 5 sections of distinct periods: the Red China, the Beijing Spring, the Open China, and then the backlash period, and now the current kind of where to China. Actually, I could present 50 objects, and that was my original concept, but that would be too long for our limited time. There are many themes and subtopics, and our time is limited, so we can't really dive deep into those topics. So, but I hope I can at least tease your curiosity or juggle your memory with these personal reflections through objects that I have kept all these years. Actually, these are not mere objects, because in them are people, ideas, passion, frustration, experience, and memories. So let's get started. Oh, yeah. Okay. So our journey takes us back to August 21, 50 years ago. That day, I joined a group of 15 radical youth leaders from the Philippines on a 3-week tour of China. We were invited by the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, also known as Youxie in Chinese. Now, that time, most countries, including ours, did not have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. The few Filipinos who traveled to the PRC in those days risked being targets of an anti-communist witch hunt upon returning home. This is my first ever passport, and the yellow card beside it was mandatory at that time to show the traveler was vaccinated of smallpox. Of course, that's no longer required, but maybe in the future, we'll have a new yellow card when we travel. Now, China then was the forbidden nation, poor and weak and isolated from most of the world, kind of like North Korea today. It was illegal for Filipinos to travel to those places. In fact, our Philippine passports, like mine here, contained an official warning that stated that the document was not valid for travel in communist-controlled states of the then Soviet Union, Cuba, Korea, Vietnam, and China, among others. So the official warning did not stop us. Our group took a plane to Hong Kong. We went in 2 separate groups, so we won't be detected. And then we picked up our Chinese visas in Hong Kong. On August 21, we took a train from Hong Kong to Shenzhen and stopped over in Guangzhou and then flew to Beijing the same day. We arrived at night in Beijing. So these passports and old mementos were stashed away here. And you could tell I sat in seat 19A on this Cathay Pacific flight to Hong Kong, and then destination, China. So here we are, 15 of us student leaders, young academics, professionals, including a Benedictine monk, Carlos Tayag, and a Muslim youth leader, Nizam Abubakar. We traveled to China, hosted by Youxie. We went there because we were curious to see for ourselves the so-called Red China. So there I am, wearing long hair and tight pants. I was 20 years old and a big fan of the Beatles, the Rolling Stone, and Bob Dylan. here, our group photographed in front of Chairman Mao's birthplace in Shaoshan, Hunan province. So at home, we were branded as radicals or pinkos because we openly criticized President Marcos's policy. We organized protests against him, big demonstrations, and also against the Vietnam War. We warned that Marcos planned to declare martial law so he could stay in power as a dictator, except that we did not know when he might do so. It's a long story, but just a week before our China trip, we heard there was a bombing incident. I'm sorry, just a week into our China trip, while we were visiting Yan'an, we were told that there was a bombing incident in Plaza Miranda the same day that Marcos also suspended the writ of habeas corpus. This is again, August 21, 1971. And this same night, they arrested hundreds of political opponents, including student and youth leaders like us. And there was not much, not much details were available. Our host told us that much, and there was no internet, there were no phone lines, phone links to Manila, no daily newspapers covering that. So we were all in blackout mode. Now, our visas shown here were not stamped on our passports, but they were merely clipped, paper clipped onto our passports, perhaps to give us deniability in case we went home. But in the end, 5 of us had to stay in China indefinitely. And the paper on the right, paper on the left was a renewal of our visa that was supposed to be valid through through October that year. Of course, in the end, we didn't need that. Now, growing up in the Philippines, I've read dribs and drabs about China. I read Edgar Snow's, Red Star over China. I read Mao's Little Red Book, but I really knew very little about what was then commonly known as Red China. In fact, the first time I watched East is Red, that song and dance Chinese propaganda film praising the greatness of Chairman Mao and the Communist Party, that was shown in my college, the Philippine College of Commerce, months before this trip. But I snored midway through the 2-hour film. Still, most of my contemporaries and I were curious to see this communist nation in the making, not really knowing what to expect. And what did we see? A China in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, which began in 1966 and ended only in 1976. And the oft-repeated slogan at that time was, never forget class struggle, because China was in the midst of this class warfare, divided into classes, and you're either a revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. And many people, many families suffered in that period because of that class warfare. China then was worshipped as a demigod, and people were brandishing that little red book like a Bible. So we were stranded in this alien place, struggling with boredom and not allowed to attend school. So we asked our hosts if we could work and earn our keep. They suggested that maybe we should go to the countryside, just as many young Chinese youths and intellectuals were doing. So we agreed, even though we knew how difficult that experience and existence could be. Now, when our host told us that we were going to Hunan, Mao's birthplace, we were excited. When we pulled out our maps to figure out where it was, we decided the climate there must be much more pleasant because it was south of frigid Beijing. We were wrong. So when we arrived in Hengyang State Farm in Hunan Province in December 1971, it was snowing furiously, ferociously. Now, this is one of the few photographs taken during our time, and you may see the snowman there. Now, life on the farm was tough, but we fired ourselves with this romantic notion that we were participating in this noble socialist experiment. We also inspired ourselves that we were getting a rare close-up look at life in China's revolutionary countryside. We would plant and harvest rice when it was in season. We picked tea leaves, dug ditches, fed pigs, repaired roads. But of course, romance of working for the revolution and learning from the peasants, that romantic romance wore off very quickly. Magtanim ay di biro. And we hadn't done that at all. So after sweating in the fields, we had to face stifling monotony and boredom because there was little else to do after work. And of course, we were terribly, terribly homesick. By the end of 1972, our time at the Hunan State Farm was up, and my fellow exiles and I were reassigned to a fishing corporation in Yantai, Shandong province. Yantai was a charming, underdeveloped port city. It's an overnight train ride from Beijing, and it was also very cold. On board Yantai's trawlers, we would sail for 5 to 7 days at a turn to catch seafood. We all had to wear this kind of working jacket during this time. And I've kept this jacket all these years. So at the end of a working day, we anchored in the high seas, and once again, we had nothing else to do except to talk, play cards, and sleep. While others slept, I read voraciously to improve my grasp of the Chinese language. It was a tedious, mind-numbing exercise, but a welcome break from the physical labor, and it paid off later. Now, China then, the Red China, was an incredibly crazy time. Personality cult was at its height. Mao pins, Mao portraits, Mao quotations, they're everywhere. Newspapers, radio, TV, wherever I turned, it was Mao everywhere. And I don't know why, but I've kept tons of these in my boxes and baul. Now, providing food, clothing, housing to 800 million Chinese, that was the total population of China in the 1970s. Now, those had been China's overriding challenge, and that's been the case since time immemorial. Now, years of central planning, rigid central planning, mismanagement, and natural disasters conspired to create severe shortages of food and other needs. So in the first 10 years of my exile years, food, oil, cotton, and other essential goods were rationed. We needed ration coupons like these to go with cash whenever we needed them. And I've kept them, again, to remind me of how difficult time was. Now, to adapt to life in China, I exerted much effort to learn the Chinese language, Mandarin. Before I enrolled in the Beijing Languages Institute in 1974, I already had picked up enough words and phrases to be able to converse with friends and co-workers. And to make more progress, I also borrowed a blue 2-inch thick English-Chinese, Chinese-English dictionary, pictured here. It was a special compendium of commonly used terms and phrases. It belonged to a translator, a friend of mine, and it was issued only to interpreters and cadres who were involved in foreign affairs and education. It was not available in bookstores. Basically, it was a political glossary, sprinkled with Maoist slogans and arcane ideological vocabulary of the Cultural Revolution. Many of those words and phrases are no longer in use because of their relevance during the politically steep 1970s. But they were at that time important to know by heart. So I copied the dictionary's entries into notebook. I copied them complex character by character and memorized their English translations. After a year, when I had copied almost 1/3 of the entries into 3 notebooks, the time came to return this book to my friend. He was so moved by my efforts to master his language that he gave it to me as a gift, and I still have it. To learn Mandarin formally, in 1974, my fellow exiles and I enrolled at the Beijing Languages Institute. Now, while as a student, on the eve of the October 1st National Day celebration in 1974, I was fortunate to join the annual state banquet hosted by the Premier Zhou Enlai in the Great Hall of the People. It was a rare opportunity to see in person the most respected and beloved premier. I had seen him in person in 1971 with the Philippine Youth Delegation in the same occasion and venue. He was handsome and charismatic, moving from table to table, clicking glasses of Mao Tai. This time, however, he looked thin and haggard. He gave a very short speech, translated into English in these 2 pages, and it turned out to be one of his last public appearances. He was already ill of cancer at that time, and he passed away a year and a half later. Spring arrived in 1977. Mao died a year earlier, and Deng Xiaoping quickly came back to power and started his ambitious reform and opening up program. But who would execute his program, his blueprint? Deng Xiaoping realized they needed a generation of well-educated, competent talents, and they didn't have them. In late 1976, China restored the so-called Gaokao, the national college entrance exams, which had been suspended for 10 years. So in 1977, China enrolled the first batch of college students who got in through competitive exams. Some 5.7 million youths took the exams, competing for 250,000 openings in universities and 400,000 in technical schools. So less than 1 to 5 chance. So in autumn of 1977, I was fortunate to enroll at Peking University to do a 4-year course in Chinese history, together with the so-called class of 1977. It's an illustrious class, group of students, because alumni include the current Premier Li Keqiang, who studied law. It also included Wang Juntao, a genius of sorts, and now a dissident on political exile in Queens, New York, and the former Chongqing party chief and Politburo member, my classmate Bo Xilai, who is now in jail. This was our graduation photo taken in the spring of 1972. I'm seated in the first row, second from the right. So No elaborate ceremony, no togas, no throwing of the hat, just this very simple group picture. Now, one of the highlights of my 4-year stay at Peking University, also known as Beida, was my time playing with the varsity basketball team. We won, I'm seated there on the extreme left. We won the All Beijing Championship in the spring of 1979. And in the summer of 1979, we traveled to Chengdu and represented Beijing in the National College Championship, the first ever after the Cultural Revolution. We played well. We reached the semifinals and placed third overall. My teammates gave me the privilege to keep the team's official banner pictured here. I've misplaced my medal, but I've kept this banner framed. In May 1981, my Peking University roommate, a history buff, surprised me. How about we visit Zhongnan High with my family? Well, of course, I said. It's China's equivalent of the Malacanang Palace. So I knew it was off limits to mortals, not to speak of foreigners like me. My roommate said, this was an exceptional case. The sprawling compound will be opened on Nebu basis, meaning for internal consumption only, meaning no outsiders. So we went, me passing for a local. We were able to walk around casually and even visit Chairman Mao's official residence. We could not take pictures inside his residence, but I remember peering into his spacious but sparsely furnished bedroom, his library, and the living room where he met state guests like Edgar Snow, Richard Nixon, and perhaps the Marcos family. Now, my deepest impression was how spacious his bathroom was, and next to the toilet seat was a small table piled up with books and facsimiles. Perhaps he read his books to pass his time there. Now here in this picture, it was the original entrance ticket and a souvenir group picture we took. Now special talaga na nakapasok ako. Nakasulat sa likod ng entrance ticket ang instructions. Pasok kayo sa number 81 South Gate. Foreign guests are off limits. Bawal magdala ng bag at dangerous objects. Huwag magkalat. Sumunod sa patakaran at disiplina. So question, paano kaya nakakuha ng tickets ang aking roommate? Galing daw sa isang nakatira sa compound. Sino kaya? Secret. Now, speaking of souvenirs, it was not beneath the caretakers of Zhongnan High to make some extra renminbi, people's money, by selling visitors a range of souvenirs. Postcards, pencils, address booklets, even fancy thermometers. I also bought a t-shirt, which is no longer wearable. And of course, I snapped them all. Now, how can I talk about my China experience without talking about food? Because as you know, for many Chinese, after all, life revolved around eating. And growing up as a child in the Philippines, I often associated China with food. Mami siopao, pancit canton, lumpiang Shanghai, tikoy. But in the first few years in China, food supply was so tight, traditional dishes were not available or could not be prepared because the ingredients were not available. As I said earlier, you needed ration coupons even just for the basic grain. By the way, you could not find pancit canton in Guangzhou or lumpiang Shanghai in Shanghai. They were Chinoy's creations, wonderful creations. Now, for special occasions during that time, we could only indulge in Peking duck, which was available, or the hot pot meals. But it was only years later, after the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, when various dishes and cuisines enjoyed a revival. So Sichuan cuisine, Yunnan, Dongbei, Yangzhou, Fujian. So I began to discover and enjoy China's diverse and delicious cuisines only afterwards. In Beijing's dirt markets or antique markets, I picked up a range of food-related collectibles, including these chopsticks that residents at that time were discarding in exchange for forks and spoons made of metal or new chopsticks made of bamboo and plastic. Now, even as late as 1978, many places in China were off limits for foreigners, to foreigners. It did not stop me from exploring new places. I'd heard of a town named Dezhou in Shandong province, where a sultan of Sulu was known to have died there in 1417 on his way home after paying tribute to the Chinese Yongle Emperor in Beijing. The East King of Sulu, Padaka Pahala, and some of his entourage were actually buried there. So I was keen to visit, but it was off limits. Samaban, what to do? So I bought a return train ticket from Beijing to Shanghai and got off in Dezhou station, which was midway to Shanghai, and got off. I rented a bike and spent most of the day looking for the Sultan Sulu's burial place, including his tumulus pictured here. That same day, at night, at the same day, I took the train back to Beijing. It was a most memorable trip. And if you have a chance, I encourage you to visit the tomb of the King of Sulu in Dezhou, Shandong. So I've covered Deng Xiaoping's Reform and Open Door program as a time correspondent from 1992 to the year 2000. We at Time called it the Second Revolution because it really was very revolutionary. It was an exciting period. A lot of changes happened during that time. Now, in the initial years, even during Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up literally meant opening closed cities and counties and towns. When I first arrived in China, most of them were off limits to foreigners. Now, in March 1991, the Foreign Ministry's Information Department of China sent out a document to Beijing-based correspondents informing us of the updated list of newly opened places. All told, 733 cities and counties made the list. That's 733 out of some 4,000 cities and counties nationwide. So that means the door was open, but only ajar. Now, some sectors started to open up too. One of the best part of living and working in China is you get to meet a lot of interesting, smart people. I met a lot, among them Mr. Ying Ruocheng, the actor, director, playwright, translator, and at one time, a vice minister of culture. Fluent in English and a master of Chinese language and literature, he is best known outside China for his role as the jail warden in Bertolucci's The Last Emperor, and many other roles. But to me, he is best remembered for translating Death of a Salesman, and in 1983 for talking Arthur Miller to go to Beijing and co-direct the Chinese production of the play Death of a Salesman. Ying himself played the role of Willy Loman, and the play staged to enthusiastic audiences for 3 months. This is, to me, an example of how open China became. Now, dance parties had become a bit of a craze at the end of the Cultural Revolution. Once banned as a form of bourgeois decadence, social dancing grew in popularity even in campuses after the Cultural Revolution. The cafeterias in Peking University became dance halls at night or on weekends, and we students waltzed and tangoed to music blaring from boombox. And what about this newfangled Western thing called disco or disco? Now, few people knew, and I was expected to teach my curious Chinese friends. Now, luckily, one Chinese agency came out with a booklet that offered some method and illustrated steps that to what I thought was a totally freewheeling dance moves. This is one of the few original paintings I bought and kept in the mid-1980s. It's an oil on paper painting by Yan Li, who later emigrated to the US. This was the portrait of his then Chinese girlfriend, Li Shuang, who later got caught in the middle of the so-called Li Shuang incident. She was one of the founders of the Xinxing, or the Stars, a group of mostly untrained avant-garde artists who challenged the strict tenets of traditional culture and politics. Li Shuang was arrested after she began living with a French diplomat who was separated from his wife and lived alone. She was sentenced to 2 years of re-education through labor, and this led to a diplomatic tension between China and France. Later, the two sides reached an agreement. Li was released, and she eventually emigrated to France, where she still lives and paints. Now, the case highlighted the Chinese puritanical taboo against contacts, liaison, or intermarriage between Chinese citizens and foreigners. It helped end the ban on intermarriage between Chinese and foreigners. And I am writing my memoir, and in it, I write about my own problematic friendships with Chinese girlfriends. So, abangan. One of the joys of my years in China was travel. And one of the magical travels I've done was Tibet. I had visited Tibet 3 times. The second time in the late 1980s was to cover for Time magazine the opening of the Lhasa Holiday Inn. The third, to cover for CNN the groundbreaking of the Beijing-Tibet railway link and other stories. But to me, the most memorable was the first in 1982, just after I graduated from Beida and right before I started my job at Time magazine. I spent 2 weeks there and saw Tibet in its most raw, spontaneous, and pristine state. Hardly any tourists, only basic guest houses and poor public transports. I walked a lot. And the first 3 days were wasted because I was so sick due to high altitude. But I had a wonderful time walking the streets, hanging out with traders in the Bajiaojie market, visiting villages and towns and temples and homes. Now, one day I was aimlessly walking in Lhasa's main drag, and I watched and listened to an itinerant folk singer plucking his ma tou qin, or horse head guitar. No one was dropping money into his hat on the pavement, so I offered to buy his guitar. He said, yeah, he could make a new one, and so he agreed. I never learned how to play, but I kept it as a perfect memento of the folk singer and that magic of Tibet. Now, over the years, opening up had turned China into a huge market for virtually everything: steel, copper, grain, oil, and other raw materials, even cosmetics, and yes, even junk food. In 1992, Beijing opened its first McDonald's. Food that day was handed out for free to give the Beijingers a taste of Americana. 40,000 customers packed the store's 700 seats. I was there and I still keep this commemorative wristwatch handed out to journalists. Western style fast foods like McDonald's, KFC, and Pizza Hut have largely succeeded in China, in part because they injected Chinese elements into their menu or into their look, thus making them seem less foreign to Chinese customers, and making some families think that eating there was no longer a special occasion, but as ordinary as eating out for dim sum or jjajangmian. In fact, I know a Chinese friend who says his son for years thought McDonald's was a Chinese brand because since childhood, the boy had been dragging his parents to eat at the Golden Arches. Now, soon after China's door opened to the outside world, French fashion guru Pierre Cardin was already at China's doorstep. In 1978, he was the first to hold a mini fashion show in a Beijing hotel. He made a big splash by launching his collection on a runway fashion show on the Great Wall. Up until then, China's fashion seemed colorless, a mix of gray and green and blue. Pierre Cardin helped change the Chinese to be individuals, diverse and creative through fashion. In 1981, Cardin signed the first joint venture in China to open Maxim's restaurant in central Beijing. The opening event was attended by Chinese officials and other, Beijing literati, including tall and beautiful Chinese who doubled as his fashion models. The restaurant was not the first Western one to open in Beijing, but it surely raised the bar for bourgeois-style fine dining in Beijing, which was a most improbable setting for Maxim's in Beijing. And in fact, Cardin himself, when I interviewed him, said, "This was like a dream." Now here's one memento I've kept from that period, a stylishly designed Maxim's ashtray. Now, reform and opening up was never smooth sailing. There was a backlash, a pushback, and it was not pretty sometimes. As China became more and more porous to outside influences, communist arch conservatives counterattacked. In 1983, they pushed a campaign against what they call spiritual pollution or bourgeois liberalism. It was a catch-all for anything new concepts, new ideas that they despised. They blamed them for all the bad influence of Western capitalism. And I wore this T-shirt during that time. Months later, Deng Xiaoping stopped the ideological campaigns, arguing that when you open the windows, flies and mosquitoes are bound to come in along with the fresh air, and it was nothing to worry about. My colleagues and I, bourgeois liberals, felt good hearing that. Still, the reemergence of the anti-spiritual pollution campaign revealed factional differences at the top. Leaders debated these vexing, difficult contradictions. How to continue China's open door policy while remaining loyal to Marxist-Leninist tenets. How to get rich while staying socialist. That was what I sensed when we covered the 13th Communist Party Congress in 1987. It was the first time journalists were allowed in as observers. And here I am with correspondents from the New York Times, Der Spiegel of Germany, Chicago Tribune of the US. Now, I love this official photograph that a friend found in a Beijing dirt market. Here I am next to an Italian colleague, Barbara, in white, in front. It's a picture of the at the end of the once in every 5-year meeting, the 13th Party Congress held in November 1987. Now, that was a typically choreographed political exercise, except this time, the journalists were invited to a series of press conferences featuring senior officials, in line with the spirit of Tomingdu, or transparency, or equivalent to Gorbachev's glasnost. These were the buzzwords of that time, and Tomingdu was proposed by the then Premier Zhao Ziyang, pictured here. The high point took place in the Great Hall of the People when Zhao Ziyang, then 68, was introduced to us as the newly elected General Secretary of the Communist Party. Now, for an hour, he joked and gave off-the-cuff remarks, answers to our unfiltered questions as he worked his way through a U-shaped line of reporters. The press event was, to me, a punctuation mark of my 30-year career as a foreign correspondent. Alas, 2 years later, Zhao was dismissed, the biggest scapegoat of the political struggle that followed the bloody suppression of the Tiananmen protests in 1989. China's socio-economic and political contradictions came to a boil on Tiananmen Square in 1989. Our Time Magazine reporting team, featuring our friend Sandra Burton on the left, Rick Hornick to her right, and then Robin Moyer, our photographer. Our reporting team covered the protests from beginning to end. It started as a memorial gathering honoring the departed reformist communist leader Hu Yaobang, and then it evolved into a massive protest and ended into a tragic massacre in Beijing. Now, I've kept many mementos of Tiananmen 1989, and among them is this strip of red cloth ripped from a protest banner and turned into headbands that were given away. This one was given to me by one of the marshals on the square. He was guarding the square in late evening of June 2nd, and he said he was determined to stay in place, even though we both agreed, we both could sense that it may end badly. I didn't see him again. And in fact, it did end badly. It was in the wee hours of June 4th. The next morning, however, I was in Time Magazine's Beijing Bureau, finishing up the fact-checking of the cover stories that we had quickly put together. A woman phoned me and said, my friend, Ho Dejian, picture here strumming the guitar, she said Ho was wondering if I could pick him up from a nearby hospital where he took refuge overnight. I told her to call me back in 10 minutes. I had to think it over. Was it a good idea? Sure, Ho Dejian was a dear friend. He had invited me to live in his spacious apartment for months while I was looking for my permanent housing in Beijing. And yes, he was the darling of Beijing communist leaders when he defected from Taiwan to the mainland years earlier. But by then, he had become such a controversial lightning rod since he joined two other Beijing intellectuals on a hunger strike in Tiananmen in support of these protesters. Their action boosted the already sagging protest movement and I'm sure angered communist officials. In fact, Ho was in Tiananmen the night the PLA troops cleared the square, and he helped negotiate to allow protesters like him out of the square before the PLA troops took control of the square. But I knew he must be on some wanted list. At the same time, he's a dear friend. So I agreed to pick him up. The streets were deserted that morning, guarded only by PLA troops. And there, Ho was standing at the entrance of the Capital Hospital. He tried to disguise as a doctor in a white lab coat, but still, some onlookers at the gate recognized him. And that made me really nervous. And it turned out another man was with him, Liu Xiaobo, the other Tiananmen protest leader who was later given posthumously the Nobel Peace Prize. So I told both of them, hop in and duck. And I drove away gingerly and I dropped them off to a safe house. Now, 2 years later, when I saw Ho Dezhen again in Taipei, he gave me a copy of a cassette tape with his latest music compositions and songs. He scribbled a note at the back, which reads, "To Jimmy, the most courageous driver on June 4th, 1989. It was one of the best compliments I've ever heard. A music to my ears." Now, who would have thought? When I first interviewed Jiang Zemin, pictured here in the mid-1980s, he had just moved jobs as Shanghai mayor, a big job. And Time Magazine was interested to do a story with him, on him. The photographer who went with me, assigned to take his portrait, kept bugging me to convince Jiang Zemin to allow us into his office instead of a meeting hall so he could photograph him in his element. And to our surprise, he agreed. And in fact, he posed for us, occasionally speaking to us in conversational English. Years later, when he gave Time an exclusive interview in 1999, he had risen to become China's president and party chief, preparing to visit the US. So for the interview, I brought with me the old picture that I had kept. "You hardly aged," I told him. "Oh, you are a Xiao Didi, a younger brother," he remarked as he autographed the picture. So yeah, who would have thought? Who also would have thought that in fact China has been doing elections? Since Deng Xiaoping returned to power in 1978, China had in fact been experimenting with direct elections, but only at the village level, China's lowest level of government. And in the 1980s, a few villages have encouraged competitive multi-candidate elections. Some even allowed candidates to give speeches or debate and to make formal platforms and to use secret ballot boxes. I witnessed several of these village elections in northern and southern China, a few times accompanied by American political scientists and a team from the Carter Center. Now, some Chinese advocates had tried to push these experiments on a higher level, say a county level, like they did in Buyuan County in Sichuan province. But they were quickly aborted by officials worried about political chaos. Now, this in the picture is a remnant of a secret ballot used in a village election that I observed years ago. It's part of a recycled paper box, perhaps containing some American soft drink, and it was discarded. I picked up a part of it. Now, alas, this is now a mere political relic. I covered the 1997 Hong Kong handover for Time magazine. That night, several hours before July 1, 1997, I joined a small group of journalists, boarded a passenger ferry from Hong Kong's Central District, and navigated our way to the border with Shenzhen. It's near the Shenzhen Bay. We waited there for more than an hour while it poured and poured with rain. Finally, around midnight, I stood on the ferry's open-air lower deck and watched the first batch of armed ships of the PLA Navy sail into Hong Kong. And it was a moving scene. I was there as a witness of history. And for those few days, various groups gave away mementos of all sorts, mementos of the handover, including picture books, a bag, commemorative coins, and wrist watches, like the one pictured here on the left. Now, much have changed since then, and even though the souvenir watches have stopped ticking. On May 7, 1999, 5 US guided bombs unintentionally struck the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing 3 Chinese journalists. And President Bill Clinton later apologized, saying it was accidental, but outraged Chinese officials called it a barbarian act. Protests in Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities continued for several days. In Beijing, thousands of rock-throwing protesters trapped the US ambassador and other staff in the embassy. They held protests, posters like carrying raw, angry slogans like these that I collected. The handwritten one reads, "Down with the US," and the printed one says, "Those who play with fire will burn oneself to death." Now, these to me is a cautionary episode and reminds us of how fragile US-China relations can be, so that even an accidental act can lead to a scary conflagration. Now, when the Houston Rockets selected 7'4" Yao Ming as the #1 draft in 2002, he came to our Beijing bureau accompanied by his parents and coach for live and taped interviews. It was my most neck-breaking assignment. That morning, a photographer snapped this photo of him with parents, the photo on the right, showing him with his parents. And the next day, after this picture on the right was published in the US and other places, the Houston Rockets executives phoned me, frantically asking, "Is Yao Ming sending out a message with that poster hanging on the wall in the background?" I was perplexed, but later I knew. Small wonder. One of the slogans at the bottom of this poster reads, "Down with US imperialism." So I had to send the Houston Rockets executives a formal letter to vouch that the poster on in the picture was part of my collection of vintage posters that had been hanging on our office wall for years, and that Yao, I assure them, had nothing to do with it. So finally, this 30th object. For my birthday in 2014, As a gift, my loving wife bought 2 tickets for front row seats to a Bruno Mars concert in Beijing. Now, I hardly knew a Bruno Mars song, but I did know that he was a superstar, and I did know of his Filipino ancestry. So I'm very proud of Bruno Mars. Now, I expected a especially memorable night, but I was not prepared to see that he and his songs have become so popular among Chinese audience. Yes, they were mostly urbanites and young, so it will be misleading to conclude that the whole of China had become so porous they all know Bruno Mars and his songs. Still, it is remarkable to see the audience sing along with Bruno Mars. This is the scene.
So guys, this is our first time ever playing a show out here in Beijing. Thank you guys so much for making it so special for us. Everybody in the building, sing this chorus with me one last time. I'm gonna start it off, and y'all come on. When I see you. Sing it. We can get louder than that, y'all. And we
So, this scene made me recall the Chinese youth I had met the past 5 decades. The Red Guards in Beijing in 1971, the re-educated youths in Hengyang State Farm in 1972, my classmates in Beida in 1977, the young protesters on Tiananmen in 1989, and now these. Where will China's youth take China into the 21st century and beyond? I wonder. As for me, 2 things that happened helped shape my future. One, coming to China and going to school in China. 2, the opening up of China from 1979 onwards. And those 2 together created my career, shaped my China journey. I had an incredibly rich experience in China because of those 2 things. I am grateful to my Chinese friends for taking me into their lives, however risky and difficult sometimes they were. I am grateful to all my mentors at Time Magazine and CNN, who employed me to watch up close the largest nation in the world on the cusp of change. I feel fortunate to have had a ringside seat into China's history, and I got it because I made that fateful trip to China 50 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Jimmy, for that very interesting and informative presentation. I learned so much, not only about your personal experience in China, but also about Chinese history, culture, politics, from the 1970s up to Bruno Mars, up to the contemporary period. I particularly like the part where you, of your presentation, where you uh, uh, told us about your experience when you were exiled to China's countryside, where you had to had to work hard labor and endure extreme homesickness. You were in your 20s, right, sir?
I was
Parang
20.
Yeah, 20, exactly 20. So I was thinking, kaya ko ba yun kaya kung ako yung nasa posisyon ninyo, no? So thank you very much, Sir Jeannie. Maraming salamat po. Now we open the floor for questions or comments. Siguro we can start with a question from one of our Zoom registrants. Okay. This is the question: where were you during the Tiananmen incident?
During that Tiananmen incident, of course, I followed it. I was on the square almost every night from beginning to end. But that night, we kind of felt that something weird was going on and that something bad might happen. So I agreed with my time colleagues, three of us covering it, that we would take turns. We knew it was going to be a long, long day. So my shift, we agreed on 3 shifts, and my shift was supposed to be sometime past midnight. But already before midnight, many things were already happening. So I already walked out of my house before midnight, but I was on the on the eastern side of the square at that time, because my colleague Sandra Burton, as agreed, was already out there many hours before. Another colleague was somewhere else. So I was mainly on the eastern side, near the bridge where many tanks and APCs were stranded, going out, trying to go into the square. And then only later did I move closer to the square. But by then I was told by my colleagues, go back to the bureau and tell our editors that this thing was happening. So I went back to the bureau before midnight, and I became the link to our New York editors. We agreed that we would change the cover for that week. We already had finalized the cover, something else. So we took out many stories, and we were given 6 hours or 7 hours to file and for that cover story. So I took a lot of reports by phone from my colleagues in the fields, and I relayed them, I typed them out, and I did my own reports until the wee hours of June 4th.
Okay, thank you, sir. Anyone else who would like to ask question, you can raise your hand. There's yung reaction button at the bottom of the screen, or you can put your question in the chat box. Meron po ba? Wala. I have one question. Wala pa. I have one
Sige.
question, sir. Did the Marcos government attempt to lure you back to the Philippines?
Apparently they did. Sometime in the early 70s, perhaps when Imelda Marcos visited China, she sent out feelers through her Chinese hosts saying that she wanted to bring us back home. And it sounded like bringing us back meant that she wanted to use as political trophies. In other words, that it had some kind of condition. So through her host, we turned it down. We declined. We rebuffed the offer. I also know that at one point, the then Senator Laurel visited Beijing as part of the Senate mission, and in his meeting with a vice premier, he asked about us, and not really saying he wanted to take us back, but he inquired about us, and the Chinese premier simply said that they're doing well, they're in good health, and they are studying or learning. Those were the only kind of instances that I remember.
Okay, thank you, sir. There's one question from Mr. Roberto Lim. What was the Cultural Revolution like as a Filipino? Was it somewhat similar to how Western portrayals of the period, like chaotic, traumatic, and highly political?
Of course, we got there midway through the Cultural Revolution. 1971, it didn't end until 76. So we did catch the militant phase of the Cultural Revolution, where you have everyone wearing the Mao badge, everyone holding a red book, and every other sentence had a Mao quote. But we missed the violent or chaotic part, which happened in the late 60s when factions of the Red Guards and of different people, even in the military, were fighting violently. So we didn't see that. Although you could read about that in the Chinese history, and the Chinese themselves referred to how chaotic and how disastrous was. But again, by the time we got there, it was still very militant. There were still Red Guards marching around, and they were still spoke in uniform, militant way. But then, curiously, sometime in October that year, we sensed a change in the mood. We gradually noticed that our Chinese host had stopped wearing the Mao badges on their jackets, and some of them stopped carrying the red book. And it turned out that it was an offshoot of the so-called Lin Biao affair, which supposedly happened in September that year. You remember, Lin Biao was the designated successor to Mao. He was the defense minister. He was number 2 in the Politburo. And then suddenly in September, he disappeared. In fact, October 1st, we expected him to be in that state banquet. He was not there. We didn't really know about it. The Chinese didn't talk about it until sometime mid-October. And that started Lin Biao's disappearance from the scene, started the dialing down of the craziness of the Cultural Revolution.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. This is another question. Since food was one of the memories you've included in your 30 objects, what are some of the favorite and memorable food you had? Which restaurant served the best baked Beijing duck?
Oh, Beijing duck, of course, in the beginning, even during the hardest time, it was still available. And I think my favorite then was the what we call the small duck, because there was the big duck, meaning there's a big restaurant serving in big ways, and then there was this small duck, smaller version of it, which we liked better. There was later many other duck restaurants appeared, but aside from Peking duck, I really liked the hot pot. Or we call it the Mongolian style hot pot, and they came again in various versions. I like the simpler ones, where you have mutton or lamb sliced very thinly, and along with beef and mushroom and vegetable and tofu. I like it because it's communal. It's a collective exercise, and yet you can personalize it depending on what kind of ingredients you prefer. And later, of course, I started to like Hunan food, Sichuan food, even though when I was on the farm, I couldn't take spicy food. That was one of the most difficult part. When we were on the farm in 1972, our Hunan cook could not make any food without throwing in spices, la jiao, and even eggs. Even the poached egg was spicy. Of course, now I love it.
Okay, thank you, sir. There's one from Angela Silva. 50 years later, while living in the Philippines, now during the pandemic, would you return to Beijing or any place in China to reside, and why?
Unfortunately, I cannot. I've been stranded in China, the reverse way, stranded in the Philippines, in Makati, the reverse way. I couldn't go back. I haven't been back since November 1989. I was supposed to, 2019. I was supposed to go back in spring of 2020 to resume my part-time teaching at Peking University. I've been doing that since I retired, only one semester a year in Peking University, so I could travel during the other part. So I've been locked down in Makati. I wish I could go back soon, but I've been trying to make full use of my time doing what I'm doing now, which is sharing with as many Filipinos my experience on China.
Okay, I think I have a question, sir. This is related to the earlier question. No? You stayed in China for 40 years. Are you a Chinese citizen now?
No, I'm not. In fact, I no longer have a place to live in China. I never bought one. And I've been renting an apartment in China. I cannot be a Chinese citizen even if I had lived there for 100 years, because China follows this principle of jus sanguinis, meaning it's based on
Blood.
your blood. Yeah. So birthright, instead of based on where you were born, right? So I've always been a proud Filipino, even all these 50 years in China. I'm known there as a Filipino who works for an American media company.
Okay, thank you, sir. We're receiving a lot of questions, no, sir?
Good.
Yeah. There's one from Marjorie Manabat. Can you affirm that there is no doubt that Tiananmen Square deaths did occur? How were you able to balance your reporting with time and with the Chinese government?
So no one really knows yet how many people really died during that period. Now, and I refrain from using Tiananmen or deaths on Tiananmen Square, because I believe no one probably died on the square itself. I've talked with eyewitnesses or people like Ho Dejian who were there during the takeover, during the arrival of the PLA troops on the square, and he vouches that he didn't see anyone died. But it doesn't mean that no one died during the Tiananmen protest. So I prefer to call it the Beijing massacre instead of Tiananmen massacre, because in fact, a lot of the deaths, I believe, occurred in the fringes of Beijing, of Tiananmen Square, on their way, on the way of the PLA troops to the square. They were met by violent resistance or protest. There were barricades along the way, including not just students, but also citizens who were trying to stop them from going into the square. Some of them didn't believe that the People's Army would shoot at the people. Some of them thought that they were only shooting rubber bullets. So a lot of them were fearless in that sense. And a lot of them, I think, died kind of during that time. How many died? I know the media had been using thousands, some even earlier, some even saying 10,000. I don't believe that, but it could be in the thousands, it could be in the hundreds, but maybe the closest estimate was from the Chinese Red Cross early on, which was in the hundreds, but then even they were stopped from giving out estimates. So we don't really know. I think I would rather use, say, hundreds were believed to have died that night.
Okay, there's a question here from Cho Chong Tan. When you escorted the two Chinese guys to the safe house, was this eventually known to the authorities?
I suppose, in fact, I assume so. I didn't really talk about this until much later. But I assume that they know. I'm not sure if they knew at that time. Maybe not, because I think the authorities were in a chaotic mode, hours after the takeover of the square, hours after the protests were dispersed. And yeah, I think even the police and security authorities were not on top of things in the first few hours.
Okay, so there's another one here. I was wondering if you still keep in touch with your old colleagues from all these years ago, from all these years. Old colleagues in China, like
in China.
your basketball
first-
team, for instance. Your
Oh yes,
yeah.
I have a social media group with my basketball team, men and women, and it's going on. I am in touch with them often. We got together a lot when I was able to go, when I was in Beijing. I am in touch with my former roommates and other classmates. And of course, I'm in touch with many other friends who I met as a journalist all these years through the social media. And when I was there, we frequently got together over meals because they took me in not as a journalist, but as a friend, as a classmate, as a teammate.
Okay. There's one here from Wesley Chua. Hi, Jaime. I wonder if you met other Philippine revolutionaries in China, aside from our friend, the late Manuel To, of course. Thank you. Did you?
Yes, I met different groups of Filipinos in China. Some of them lived there for a few years, like I did. Some of them for a shorter period. I'm always very keen and happy whenever I met fellow Filipinos in China at that time. And we've always tried to help each other, no matter what our respective backgrounds or affiliations were at that time.
How about Filipino or Philippine revolutionaries?
Yes, of course. I knew some of them. I spent a lot of time with some of them, Filipino revolutionaries. Some of them stayed there for a while and came back or went home or went to other locations after that. Some of them I know passed away, and I'm really sad to see them go. But I've always cherished the memories that I'd spent with them during all those years.
Okay. What was the relationship between the Chinese government and foreign press? How has this relationship changed throughout the years?
It's a love-hate relationship from the beginning. Of course, in the beginning, when I started as a journalist in the early 80s, there were only a few of us. I mean, there were only maybe 100 of us from a dozen news organizations. And later, as China opened, more and more came, more and more open bureaus, added China-based correspondents. The last time, at its height, before the 2008 Olympics, I think there were like 500 foreign correspondents in China from about 100 news organizations. So in the beginning, the Chinese were very, very cautious, standoffish towards the media. They looked at the media, journalists as troublemakers, or at least source of trouble. They'll just get them into trouble. And in the beginning, they didn't even hold press conferences. I remember the first press conference the foreign ministry gave, perhaps in the late 80s, and they just read a prepared statement, and that was it. No questions, no Q&A. Later, they got more comfortable with it. And again, when I was the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club, I tried to push the margins as far as we could. And I tried to engage the Chinese officials and tried to make them comfortable with the idea that actually, if you just tell us your story, you have a better chance of getting your story told. And I think they won some, they lost some. And that's the problem. When they lost the chance, or when they think, trying was not worth it, and they started to clamp down again. And I regret to watch that kind of better relations between the media and the Chinese officials sour up the past several months because of what's going on in China, but also because how things are being handled between the media and the Chinese officialdom. I still hope that they could patch things up and that the Chinese officials will still realize the importance of the media so that they can tell the China story in a better way.
Okay, there's one from Professor Fantai. Sir Jaime, according to your time in China, what can the Philippines learn from China when the Philippines is also pursuing its social and economic development?
Well, there are many things we can learn from China. Well, first, I think we Filipinos should cast away a lot of our misconceptions or stereotypes about China and Chinese. There are many stereotypes about Chinese, many of which we learned or we acquired when we were very young. When I was very young, I had many misconceptions or stereotypical ideas of Chinese. We should cast them away. That the Chinese are sly or untrustworthy or selfish, and then of China, Red China, that everything in China is backward, everything is still done by hand. So what can we learn from China? I think one thing we can learn is humility, but also a hunger for change. China has changed so much because, well, the Chinese kind of learned from experience what went wrong, what didn't work. So I think looking back, the Chinese were able to learn from lessons from their past. They also were humble enough to open their minds to new things, new concepts, try out new things. Again, we think that the Chinese now are still probably wearing mouse suits or even wearing, braided long hair. No more. China has moved very quickly the past 30 or so years. In fact, in some places they leapfrog in technology, like the use of QR codes. They've been doing that for maybe 10 years now. China has been a cashless society. We could do a lot of things with this QR codes without having to carry cash and all those stuff. The Chinese have done a lot of technological innovation. How? Because they open their minds to new things. They're humble enough to learn from others. And I think we should do that too. Again, there are many things we could learn from China, and we should open our minds to that.
Okay, thank you, sir. This one is from Sir Romel Banlawi. Jimmy, in your 50 years of observing China, what was your most memorable experience that resonates with you until now?
My memorable, hold on. This friend from China is calling. Well, there are many things, but I suppose the most memorable would be as an exile would be locked in the trawler ship, um, looking out the window, and it was this endless high sea, and maybe the moon was shining there, and trying to tell myself that perhaps there's still hope that this will change. And this helps me in this time of pandemic, that this too will come to pass. I didn't know when, I didn't know how long, but maybe that was the time when I determined that I'll just focus on what I can do, which at that time was to improve my Chinese.
Okay, thank you, sir. This one is from Mary Uy. You mentioned something about this during your presentation. Have you written books on China, specifically your experience? May we know the titles? Are they available locally?
I haven't. Well, I wrote I co-authored a book on Tiananmen, which was entitled Beijing Massacre, published by Warner Books, but I'm sure it's out of print. It was a quickie. And then I've co-authored a book with my fellow College Editors Guild alumni. The title is Not on Our Watch, and it's a compilation of essays by fellow college editors. Then a book in Chinese was published by the Peking University. It's part of their oral history, and I was one of the alumni that they chose. It's basically based on my conversations with three graduate students of Peking University who interviewed me extensively, and then they put together this book in Chinese. I'm writing a book, my memoir of sorts. Originally, it was going to be titled The Class of 1977, but I was advised that it's too narrow. So I am rewriting it to include the years, or to focus on the earlier years of my exile, including my friendships with Chinese girlfriends. And I don't have a title yet, but maybe it's something along the lines of a fake Chinese, or because a lot of people thought I was a Chinese, but I was not really a Chinese. I don't know when I can finish it. It's almost done, and I hope to get it published soon.
Okay, thank you, sir. This one is from Justin C. Looking back, is there anything that you regret doing in China?
Is there anything that
You regret doing
regret
in China when you were
doing in
there?
China? I haven't thought of anything that was regrettable. I haven't done anything extreme in terms of myself as an exile, as a student, or as a journalist. I think I had tried to live up to myself, and it may take a while. It may take me a while to think of anything that I regret doing. There are many things perhaps that I regret not doing, but that's for another session.
Yeah, thank you, sir. From Reggie Yu, Sir Jimmy, as you have been a personal eyewitness to the colorful upheavals of China in the last 50 years, how do you see China in the next 50 years?
Yeah, there will be many caveats, but I still see China growing and growing, growing fast. Now it's the second biggest economy in the world. It's only a matter of time that China will become the biggest economy in the world. Biggest not necessarily mean the most powerful or number one. I think the US is still number one in many aspects, and perhaps will remain so in many aspects, but surely China will catch up given its scale, its demographics. But demographics wise, China also has a lot of problems because of the one-child policy. China's population is aging very quickly. That will be a drag in China's push for more progress and prosperity. I guess I should also speak about my hope for China in the next, in 50 years. I really hope China will grow into a responsible member of the international community. And with that, I mean that China can use its power, its influence in a positive way. Positive for peace and harmony, global peace and harmony, positive for prosperity for all, and as a benign or positive force or a leader in the world. I like China's old saying, do not do unto others what you do not wish others do unto you. I think it's a Confucius saying. And I think if China just stick to that, if China sticks to the message that's all over the imperial palace, which is harmony, harmony among themselves, among the people, harmony between peoples, between countries, harmony between the earth and the heavens, then I think China will go well in the next 50 years.
Okay, thank you, sir. This is again from Sir Romel Banlawi. I'm so happy to hear that Bo Xilai was your classmate. What was your impression of him, especially his outlook and leadership style?
Bo Xilai was my classmate for about 2 years until he moved to the Academy of Social Sciences to do his master's in media, I think. But during the time when we were in the same class, Bo Xilai already stood out. Well, he's very tall and handsome. Among my classmates, even though he was wearing the usual PLA jacket, he stood out because of his height and his charisma. He was in classroom and outside classroom. He was very energetic, lively, and charismatic. I remember the few times I ate lunch with them in the cafeteria, and we were all standing around, a table, and he kind of gravitated towards me because he wanted to practice his English. He was, rudimentary English, conversational English, but even then he was already curious about foreign language, but also curious about other countries. He asked a lot about the Philippines, my experience. And I think that was the same when he was already a politician. When he was the mayor of Dalian, he gave me an exclusive interview. We talked for an hour and a half. When he was giving press conferences as the Commerce Secretary, I could tell that his mind was working, trying to bring in experiences or concepts from outside. And I think he tried to do that in Chongqing as well. And unfortunately, he got into right in the middle of the political and factional struggles in China. And that was unfortunate, but I think he could have been a good top leader.
Okay, thank you, sir. This one is from Ching Ezekiel. During your exile years, how did the Chinese people treat you and your peers?
they were very nice to me, to us, in fact. Perhaps because they knew the sad circumstances of why we were still in China. So our Chinese hosts tried their best to make our lives comfortable and easy. Of course, they couldn't give us something that we missed, which was homesickness. They couldn't do anything about it. But my Chinese friends, the friends that I met all those years, including my Chinese roommates, they really treated me as a friend. In my most difficult time, missing home, like there was one Christmas time when I really missed home. I was so homesick. I spent that time, Chinese New Year actually, in the home of my Chinese roommate in Harbin. And it was at that time very rare for them to host foreigners into their homes. So on the eve of the Chinese New Year, I was in their home, and his parents prepared jiaozi, Chinese dumplings, was the symbolic way to share among the family. And her mother, as the tradition, inserted one coin into one of the dumplings. And the belief was whoever got that dumpling would have a beautiful future. And of course, I was the one who got it. And in fact, after that, my career took off and my life in China got better and better.
Well, that's a new for me, sir. So pag merong ganyan, kailangan hanapin ko yung may coin. No? This one is from Vladimir Reyes. No? Do you know whatever happened to the student that stopped the tank in Tiananmen Square? I think he's referring to the iconic photo.
The tank man.
Yeah, the
Yes.
tank man. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, and I know it's become an iconic picture. Whenever people think of Tiananmen, that's the picture that comes out. The man in front of the tank stopping this column of tanks. Well, I tell you what, breaking news, that man, I believe, is still alive somewhere, but I don't think he was a protester. Why? Because in fact, and many of you probably don't know, the context of that picture. The man, that picture was taken a day after, several hours after the square was cleared by the PLA. And in fact, the tanks, this column of tanks, were moving out of Tiananmen, not moving in to square. Now, we don't know that, right? If you just look at this picture, you think the man was trying to stop the tank from moving into the square. Wrong. The tanks were moving out already. They were moving out because they already had secured the square. They kept some, but they're moving out some of these tanks out of the square. So the picture was taken by photographers from the Peking Hotel, which was east of the Tiananmen Square. And they just happened to click on this when they saw this man in front of the tank. So why don't I think he was a protester? Why? Because I don't think he knew the context. I don't think he knew that the tanks were moving out of the square, not moving into the square. And in the way he looked to me like somebody from the province who happened to be walking around Tiananmen Square and then saw this spectacle and got angry, emotional about it, and tried to stop the tanks from moving. And then he was taken away by part of the crowd. So I think he's still out there. I don't think he was executed, as some think or assume he was. So, that's one thing that if I want to interview somebody, I would like to interview this man and ask him, why did you do that? But this is one of the iconic pictures that I've tried to at least put into context. And this is one time I'm doing it.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Siguro idagdag ko rin na question related to that. Is it true that the Tiananmen occurrence was inspired by our People Power Revolution? in the Philippines. Is it true?
I think it's true that, I mean, and I talk with a lot of students on campuses in the square at that time. Yes, it's one of the inspiration that they got from overseas people power, that a mass protest can lead to changes. Of course, they were also inspired by the other experiences, including, well, as I said, glasnost of Gorbachev also inspired them. But basically, they were also inspired by their own experience. The May 4th movement in Chinese history was a huge inspiration for students, especially at Peking University and other Beijing universities. You see that come back on and on and on when there is a youth movement in China.
Okay, thanks, sir. This one is from Tina Clemente. What would you advise people who are just beginning to study China seriously, considering how China has evolved?
I would encourage everyone who is interested to start embarking on China studies. Of course, one way to begin that is to learn the language. If that's too hard, it's okay. You can do it gradually. Take some courses, but start reading about China. Read about the present, but also read about its history. Its history is a treasure trove of lessons, the same way that Greece and Rome have been our sources of knowledge and inspiration. But China now also is worth learning from and also studying, because whatever China does or does not do will impact our lives as individuals, but also our lives as Filipinos. They're our neighbors, our big neighbor. We have differences with them, but we should know where China is coming from. To really understand China is to understand where they're coming from, their culture, their history, their mindset. And language is one, but learning the language, beyond that, you need to learn how the Chinese think, the mindset. Whenever I interviewed applicants to our job, to our work in Beijing for Time or CNN, or for interns, I always try to tell them language is one thing, but you also need to learn how to navigate around in China, around customs, tradition, rules, regulations, because there is a unique way of doing that. And if you don't know that, you'll make mistakes. You won't achieve your goals. So that's my advice. Learn the language, talk to people, read, and keep an open mind. Don't believe everything you see on the social media, and take in what is useful, what is correct, and what will help you move on.
Okay, thank you, sir. This one is from Michael Guzman of Kaisa. Hi, Jaime. What is your advice to Philippine media personnel, the best way to deal with Chinese government? Your advice to Philippine media personnel on the best way to deal with the Chinese government?
Of course, the best way is to learn the language and to see stories in their original form. But of course, that's asking too much. So what I'll ask is for the media, our media, to read extensively, to listen to various sources, to look at the various sides of the story, because like any story, there are different sides, and try to incorporate them into your story. Try to get that side, a quote or the message or the press release from the Chinese side, if you can. Of course, sometimes you don't have time for that. And I encourage, in fact, the Chinese officials to be quick at responding or issuing statements because the media cannot wait. And they cannot blame the media if their side is not aired, if they are slow. I also would encourage the media to find the opportunity to go to China and see for yourselves what China is like. You know, seeing is believing. Because it's hard really to comprehend such a complex country and people and history by just relying on third sources indirectly. So the best would be try to find opportunities to go there and see as extensively as you can, engage with the Chinese officials, but also engage with the ordinary Chinese, find out what they really think. Because, surprise, China is no longer the monolith that we assume it is. China has changed a lot. China is not just Beijing or Shanghai or Guangzhou. China is a lot of those provinces and cities, and they're going, they're changing in different paces, in different ways, and the people there also may be different from the people that we often engage with. So go as extensively as you can and dig as deeply as you can.
Okay, this is related to the earlier question, sir. This is from Sining Kota. How would you picture the relationship between the Philippines and China when the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea is placed in the center stage by the Philippine media?
Well, already it is. I mean, it's a sad state to have conflicting territorial claims. We can't choose neighbors, right? We can't move geography. So we're stuck with that. And I think that it's a very complex issue. We have won the arbitral ruling and we should stick to that. But we also must put that in context, what is best for our national interest. So we are trying to hedge our relations between China and the US and other allies. Do I agree with that? Yes, because the alternative is to take sides, to be part of an alliance, and to deal with the consequences. And the consequences could be China gets angrier at us, and China could make it difficult for a neighbor like us. Difficult in many ways, because there are many things that we can do or cannot do without China's cooperation, right? Many things, cross-border crimes, drugs, climate change, preserving our coral environment, our seas, our fishing resources. If we don't get China on board on the same kind of side on this thing, we cannot achieve those difficult goals. So for those reasons, we have to maintain good relations with China in the same way that we maintain good relations with the US and Japan and Australia. We should not be forced to take sides. And I hope our allies, China, or in other words, I hope these other countries, the US, China, Japan, I hope they don't force us to take sides. I hope they allow us to follow an independent foreign policy, a policy that's good for our national interest and our national interest alone. And so I hope we can follow that. It's not easy, but to me, that is the best direction we should take.
Okay, there's one here. Based on your experience with the Chinese youth, specifically with the Bruno Mars concert crowd, where do you think is China headed culturally and politically?
So as I said there, we cannot conclude that this is the Chinese youth now and in the future just based on that. But I think it is emblematic of the changes that's been going on in China, especially among the youth. The youth are better educated, they're better informed, not totally, but better informed than their parents. They're better connected with the outside world through the media, through diplomacy, through travel, and yes, through culture. So China has been more porous than you can imagine, but they also have their limitations. I fear that some of them are very nationalistic in a narrow way. They're patriotic, which is good, but some of them may be ultra nationalistic. So I hope they will keep opening their eyes and ears and mind to the outside world, because I think by keeping them connected, they will have a better idea of what a better world can be 50 years from now. And I hope they will take China towards that world, which is interconnected and harmonious and prosperous.
Okay, there's one here from Wesley Chua. If the next Philippine administration offers you the position of ambassador to China, will you accept it?
Oh man, that's a very difficult job. And I think we are lucky that we have a most capable person for the job at that time. My comrade and fellow exile, Chito Santaromana, is doing a terrific job as our ambassador to China. It's a very challenging job, and I'm glad to see him doing so well.
Okay, I think this is the last question because we only have like 3-4 minutes left. No, this is from Austin Ong. I'm a direct beneficiary of Sir Jimmy and Ma'am Anna's generosity. They always made time for the Filipino students in China. You mentioned Deng Xiaoping's leadership and development plan only succeeded with an educated population. The Philippines had one of the most educated population, but our development is still lagging. What do you think are some of the differences between China and the Philippines in terms of developmental model? That's from Austin.
Thank you, Austin. Yes, leadership is important, like in any other country. And I think what we hope for is a consistent, clear blueprint or direction. China succeeded, Deng Xiaoping succeeded first because he had a clear and popular blueprint for China. It succeeded because people wanted it. People were hungry for change. And Deng Xiaoping pointed the way for change. And also China benefited from its political system, like it or not. China's political system does it in 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 50-year plans. Their plans are consistent and long-term. They plan not just for tomorrow or next year or in 5 years from now. And their leaders, like it or not, are there to push those plans consistently from top to bottom. It's a top to bottom system. What the top says happens, goes. So if they want it done now, it will be done tomorrow, not next year or 5 years from now. So those are China's strengths. Of course, we have our own strengths. We have, the balance of power. We have, the 3 branches of government. But I hope we can combine that, the democratic institutions, with a strong leadership. And of course, in the end, you need people to execute them. You need young, dedicated, passionate people like my classmates in Beida, in Peking University in 1977. You need them to push that brilliant blueprint. And I hope that our youth, our young Filipinos will also do the same. And I think they will, as long as they see a clear blueprint for the future. And I hope they see their niche, their roles and their place in this bright future that we hope we will get soon. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm sure our viewers still have a lot of questions for Sir Jimmy, but because we only have a very limited time, we have to end the webinar now. It was a very informative presentation and a very fruitful open forum. We actually received more than 2 dozens of questions.
Wonderful.
More than
thank you.
20, 24, 25, if I'm not mistaken. So I wrote down all the names and the institutions of those who asked questions. As noted, this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on the PAX Facebook page. So you can watch it again and you can share it with your friends, online friends. With
Thank
that,
you.
we end our webinar. In behalf of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, I wish to thank our friends who joined us today. We particularly thank our wonderful speaker. I learned a lot, sir. Mr.
Thank you.
Jaime Florcruz, maraming salamat po sa uulitin. Thank you so much at good afternoon to everyone.
Salamat din sa inyo lahat.